Greetings. My name is Jalandra A. Davis, otherwise known as Mami Melusine. I am a writer, scholar, educator, dancer, mermaid enthusiast, and all around creative. Welcome to the Merwomanist Podcast, where we talk about Black mermaid lore, fantasy, spirituality, and aquatic culture. Dive in and enjoy. Greetings and welcome back to the Merwomanist Podcast with Mami Melusine for another video episode today. I cleaned out my office, so I'm on a roll. And I also wanted this to be visual so that I could show the book covers for the books that I'm going to be talking about. Now, I haven't been talking about books on this podcast as much as you would think for someone who my life work really specializes in books. I read books, I write about books, I write books, right? And I think that's for a few different reasons. I primarily, for my work, for pleasure reading, I read all kinds of things. But for the kind of work I'm doing with this podcast, which is an extension of my scholarship, I primarily read work by Black authors. Black women and Black non binary film authors are the majority of the people that I read. And so when I'm writing an academic journal article, I'm not afraid to critique people because the audience for academic peer-reviewed journal articles is pretty small. But in terms of talking about Black women and femmes work publicly, I have kind of had a policy of not being that critical. I think as someone who is a creative writer myself and eventually does want to go back to fiction writing, I don't want to be torn apart in nobody's review. And I don't intend to tear anyone apart. But because this is the majority of what I'm reading, and because I do have thoughts, and because the quantity of texts are growing, I think we need to start being a little bit more rigorous with what we're creating and what we're reading and what the great things are and what maybe some of the things we don't like as much. Or I think there's room to do that because I think there's a lot more out there. So I've decided to release myself from that. Also, I think another hesitance has been, I've had some experiences lately as a scholar and as someone working in this field, but also creating publicly accessible work, doing this podcast in this field, that I feel like I've done a lot of work and I'm not necessarily always being credited and cited for the work that I do. So I've been hesitant sometimes to talk about the books that I'm reading that I also might be writing about in my scholarly work because of people listening and using my ideas. Maybe writing about things a little bit more quickly than I am always able to. So that's a real thing. It's not something that I'm kind of pulling out of nowhere. It's an experience that I've actually had. But I have decided that I can control what I can control and I can't control what I can't control. And that I'm going to do what I want to do. And I will be rewarded for the work that I've put in. I'm just going to leave it at that. I'm going to talk about what I want to talk about. And I'm not going to worry about that. That's a long way of saying that I want to start doing some more book reviews. And I'm actually not starting with mermaid books, even though I will come back to Black mermaid books. But I'm starting with some of the Black YA fantasy that I've been reading lately. I have not traditionally been a YA fantasy reader. When I was growing up, YA wasn't really a category. I was reading adult fantasy. And I've really kind of come into this genre through this project because a lot of the Black mermaid books I read are either for young readers or YA. So these are two different categories, right? So you have children's fiction, and a lot of the things that I read are middle grade children's fiction, which I think that's supposed to be like grades third through sixth or something like that, right? But we're talking about like maybe 8 to 13 years old, I would say. And then you have YA, which is more teens and young adults, right? But YA fantasy is actually, it seems to be really, really popular among adults as well. And so a lot of people have been recommending me Tracey Deon's Legendborn series. So this is the cover for the first book, Legendborn by Tracey Deon. This is a Black girl centered take on Arthurian legend. So it's a contemporary YA fantasy set on a college campus, mostly. It moves to different locations after the first book. But the first book is mostly set on the campus of University, North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and it is about this underground society of young people who are the descendants and the scions of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. So I had heard about this book and I was kind of like, oh, that's interesting. How do you bring a Black girl into that? And truthfully, I wasn't super intrigued, but different, some of my grad students, people kept telling me to read it. So I was like, okay. My primary relationship to Arthurian legend is actually through somebody who unfortunately has turned out to be not a very good person. So I always feel a little bit complicated about talking about her on the podcast. But my favorite fantasy writer growing up was, unfortunately, fortunately, in terms of the writing and what I learned from it, unfortunately, because it turns out that she and her husband committed a lot of harm to people, and I won't say what that is for the sake of trigger warnings, but if you're interested, you can look it up. So, I don't condone any of the terrible things that she did, but I just have to acknowledge that she played a role in my development as a person interested in fantasy, and that's Marion Zimmer Bradley. So, Marion Zimmer Bradley's Lady of the Lake was my favorite book for many, many, many years, and though since I have learned about her crimes and the way she enabled her husband's crimes, I have not been able to go back to it. I miss it really dearly. And that's Lady of the Lake. And it is a retelling of the Arthurian legend from the perspective of the women, Guinevere, Morgane. And it is very much centered, grounded in what we usually call pagan religions, but what I call ancient European indigenous religions, right? Because in the whole world, we have indigenous religions, every culture has them. The regions that we now call Europe also had these ancient indigenous nature based goddess centered religions. And so Lady of Avalon is part of a larger series of books that depict the conquest and Christianization of the British Isles from the perspective of women who are priestesses of ancient British and Celtic religions. So it's just very deep in the magic and the lore, which is actually a pre-Christian magic and lore that is in the moment of Arthur's reign kind of coming together with Christianity. So really fascinating. I don't know what I want to say about recommending it because of what Marion Zimmer Bradley, what it's been revealed she has done. A lot of what I knew about King Arthur came from that book. So I went into a little bit like, I'm not sure, let's see, right? And I liked it. I really, really enjoyed Legendborn. I think it's really good. The world building is intense. The world building is intense. So basically, these kids, these descendants of the Knights of the Round Table, they are considered to be like, I think it's the firstborn of every generation, and it's male or female. Actually, one of the things that we learn is that because of patriarchy in past generations, sometimes families would kill the firstborn daughter to force this to the son, right? But it is actually irregardless of gender. The firstborn of every generation of the specific bloodline of the specific knight is the scion of that knight, which means that should there need to be a battle, so basically Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table are fighting these demons of the shadow world. And should there ever need to be a major battle where they need all of their powers, Arthur and his knights would awaken their scions, right? They will awaken this one descendant who is carrying their legacy, and that descendant will be imbued with their powers. And these powers come from Merlin, right? So each knight has like specific kinds of powers of speed, strength, healing, different kinds of things. So we have this Black girl, Brianna, who is grieving the death of her mother, and she goes to UNC Chapel Hill's early college program, really to just kind of get away from home and get into a different space because her father is heavily grieving her mother as well. And we do get the sense that her mother's death has something to do with this secret society. Okay. I feel like that's conveyed pretty early in the text. So she witnesses a battle between these demons and one of the Merlins and ends up infiltrating the chapter in order to find out more about her mother's death because she realizes that so we've got this secret society, they're on a college campus, they kind of live in this like fraternity house, and they're constantly fighting these demons, but no one else is supposed to know, right? The real world, the human world, people can't know about this. So the Merlins of the chapter, the descendants of Merlin, who are the magicians, they do something called mesmer, where they wipe the memories of people who witness these things. And then they kind of like have to cover it up and come up with these stories to cover up what's going on. So on her first night at this program on campus, Bree witnesses something, and one of the Merlins attempts to mesmer her, and she realized, but the mesmer doesn't take. Like she actually is able to still recover her memory, and she realizes that this happened to her before, and it happened to her when her mother died, that she was mesmered when her mother died. And her mother died from a car accident, but from this process, she begins to wonder if that was actually an accident and if these people have something to do with it. So she infiltrates this chapter with the goal of finding out what really happened to her mother. And she does this through kind of messing up at school because she's all distracted by this. So she gets assigned a mentor, and the mentor she gets assigned is the scion of Arthur within this chapter. And he's been trying to get away from his Arthurian legacy and responsibilities his whole life, but ends up agreeing to help Bree go back to his chapter and help Bree to find out. So the first book is pretty much just chronicling that. Why are there more demons? Because there's like a ramping up and increase in the demon activity. So what's going on that there's more demon activity? What happened to Brianna's mother? That's like the crux of what we're exploring for the first book. The world building is really dense, it's really intense. I mean, there is a lot of telling, right? There's a lot of characters like Nick and other people giving Brianna verbal explanations of how the scions work, how the table works. And normally I would criticize that. I would have a criticism of that much telling, but I think that in this book it's pretty necessary. I just don't know how else you would be able to convey that amount of complex information. It's not really easy to kind of drop into the world. One of the things I tell when I teach creative writing, which I don't get to teach that often, but when I do teach creative writing, or even when I sort of bring my creative writing experience into teaching literature, one of the things I talk about with students is the strategies for how you can build a world. And a lot of older science fiction and fantasy, you just have characters explain the world, especially like in the utopian fantasies. You have the character who's the outsider land into this world, and the person who's their guide or host walks around and explains everything to them, right? Like that's a really common strategy, and it's an older strategy. And so I think at this point, centuries into developing these genres, we want to see that done in a little bit of more sophisticated way and more worked into the world, like learning about the world through the characters experiencing it. This book does that as well, and I think it actually does it really well. And I do think that some of the telling is also necessary to make the world building make sense because you do have to kind of work for it a little bit. So initially, I was enjoying the book, but I was still like, is this going to be a colorblind fantasy? She's this black girl. She's in this secret society with all these white people. Are they going to act like that's not an issue? And she's in the South, right? But race does come up. I don't think we're browbeaten over the head with it, at least not in this book. I don't believe so. It does come up. She does face some racism She does face a lot of racism, but, like, not like every page. She forms relationships with the others. So when the Scions all have to choose a squire, someone who is outside of the society who will go into battle with them. So in order to infiltrate the chapter, she poses as somebody competing to be squire, right? And so she does form connections with her other pages, which is the step before squire. She forms relationships. It's not just all racism all the time, right? But it's enough to make it realistic that about this Black girl infiltrating this ancient, wealthy, white secret society in the South, right? And they do talk about class and privilege and the way that certain families are able to rig things up for their children to be able to get the good positions as the squires with the knights that are ranked more highly. Those are things that came up. And it kind of reminded me of Amari and the Knight brothers. Actually, I'm going to look at these covers. I mean, that these are 2 different books, 2 different authors, but, like, damn near identical. You have a Black girl with some wild, beautiful curly hair, but it's giving, like, 3C, 4A curls, and she, has, like, a magic ball. It's, like, almost identical. I'm gonna look up who did the cover art. But Amari and the Knight brothers had a similar setup where it's this young girl who goes into this summer program for gifted kids, but it turns out to be this parallel underground society of kids with these different powers who kind of manage the magical world that's existing underneath the real world. But it also gets into some issues of like privilege in terms of most of these being old white families who have rigged things up to make sure that their children succeed. So, yeah, so of course there's a romance. I mean, it's pretty obvious who the romance is gonna be between, but I won't say. One of the things I see, I've kind of started foraying into the booktube community, and so one of the things that I see a lot of people be critical of is the kind of obligatory romance of YA fantasy. I didn't mind this romance. I don't think the love interest was super developed. I mean, they gave him some good backstory, but I don't feel like I have a strong sense of who this person is, likes, dislikes, whatever. But he's a cute guy with like kind of a tragic, traumatic backstory. And it's a sweet romance. I think it's sweet. I don't mind it. Bree has a best friend who named Alice, who is Asian. When Alice is first introduced, she was introduced as very studious, pushing her glasses up on her nose, very formally dressed, and it was feeling a little stereotypical to me. But Alice does get a lot more dimension towards the end of the book and in the second book. So I'll take it. One of the things even though I was enjoying the book, I was like, are we gonna see some more Black people? Right? But eventually Bree does make another Black friend, Mariah, and she starts seeing a Black therapist at school. And Mariah and this therapist turn out to be root crafters. And root craft is the kind of Black hoodoo ancestral version of the kind of magic that is used by the Scions within the secret society. And I don't think that's giving too much away. So even when I started to feel a little bit disconnected as the book, as soon as the root crafter element was introduced, I was really sucked in because most of the fantasy and science fiction I read does have these elements of derived spirituality, Black spiritual practices, magic systems, ancestral veneration, root work. And those are things that I'm really, really deeply interested in. So I was like, okay, we're not just doing a colorblind fantasy of a Black girl in a white world, but we've also got this element of Black people's magic, right? So it's not hoodoo exactly. It is its own unique magic system that's developed for the book, but it is very inspired by those kinds of religious systems, African religious systems, and particularly African diasporic peoples practice of those systems, especially African American, right? So I really like that. I really like the root crafter element. And I really like the idea that the Scions have a kind of magic called, in the Merlins, use a kind of magic called aether, where they draw energy out of the atmosphere. They can use that energy to create armor, to create weapons. And so it really, the use of Aether kind of addresses some of the issues I think sometimes we might think about, like in superhero fiction, how in superhero movies, the person will suddenly be in their outfit by spinning around in a phone booth. But it was like, but where was the cape though? Was it rolled up? We just didn't really have the mechanics of how these characters actually get into these outfits. So I think that Legendborn has a really clever way of dealing with this. When the Scions enter into battle, they use this magical energy to develop armor that comes onto their body and forge these weapons that they fight with. And then when the battle's over, it just kind of dissipates. So I thought that that was really cool. The world building, the magic systems, all of that is really well thought through. It's really well developed and is very visually impactful and powerful. So I really like the idea that it's the same kind of energy, it's the same kind of magic, but Black people are using it in very different ways and for different purposes. And the Black people are not kind of cool with the Arthurian people. So another thing I liked about the book is that its take on Arthur and this whole secret society is not necessarily like what they're doing is necessary and important in fighting these demons. However, that doesn't mean they're necessarily good. Like there are some complicated things about their role in history. Remember, we're in the South, right? And these are wealthy, powerful families. So a lot of these are descendants of slaveholders, and they've been involved in all of these forms of violence and exploitation. And the book does not shy away from that. So the root crafters don't mess with the Legendborn, right? And there are Legendborn people who like hunt the root crafters, right? Because they consider rootcraft to be an unauthorized use of Aether. So they kind of take this ownership of it, like they own it and no one else is supposed to use it, and they try to control its use. So that really reminded me of things like midwifery, which Black women, Black midwives were practicing midwifery for centuries and taking care of people's health and reproductive needs, and the white medical infrastructure came in and outlawed them at the same time as they researched and took all of their knowledge and practices and used it, to develop medicines and techniques, but then outlawed them from practicing midwifery, right? And there's still many states in which midwifery is banned or illegal. And a lot of the history of how that happened was through outlawing Black midwives in particular to do their work, right? So that dynamic between the Legendborn and the root crafters, I think is really clever. So there's a lot about history in this book. And I appreciate that. I have seen some reviews by other Black readers who are not fond of that. I think there's a lot of Black readers, particularly in the fantasy and science fiction space and the YA fiction space, who feel like there is too much racial history, racial trauma, racial themes. That is too centered in too much of the literature because there's this white appetite for that. That's white readers and audiences' concept of what it means to be Black is always dealing with racism. And I'm empathetic for that point of view. While I don't necessarily disagree with it, I do think that there is something with publishing that tends to grab onto certain kinds of Black representation. I think that is absolutely true. But I guess what I don't agree with is the reduction of any piece of art or work by a Black author who chooses to engage history and racialized history, reducing that just to trauma is not something that I agree with. So I like the history stuff. I liked it. I liked the stuff, the sort of a critique of monuments, the different kinds of relationships that the Black folks have to their ancestors versus these Arthurian people. I liked it. I enjoyed that element of the book. I enjoyed that element of the first book. So I cannot say too much else about it without spoilers. So I think I'm going to kind of stop talking about Legendborn there and talk about the sequel, which I just finished, which is called Bloodmarked. Bloodmarked picks up where Legendborn leaves off, which I can't say where it leaves off. So it takes up where we leave off. Basically, this legendary war that happens every few centuries between the demons and the Legendborn has started. Bloodmarked is very much a quest, right? So the structure of the first one is more of a subterfuge. You've got Bree going undercover in the secret society. Most of the book takes place on the campus. We have the rise of this conflict with the demons. There's a lot of exposition. And then the second book is a quest format where you have characters setting off on the quest. So they're going to other locations, coming in contact with other characters, having different skirmishes. So that's the setup. Bloodmarked, I did not like as much. I thought the writing in Legendborn was really good. I thought it was really, really good writing. I thought that the dialogue felt real, even though it did some telling, which I usually am not a fan of. I think it was necessary, right? And it also did a lot of good showing as well. I thought some of the characters could have been more fleshed out, but for the most part, I did like the characters. I just thought it was written really well. In the second book, the writing is still good, but the dialogue starts to get real funky to me. It just gets really stilted. It gets a little too heavy handed. There is clearly sexual chemistry building up between Brie and another character. And the way in which they go back and forth, it's just that very predictable bickering that I think is supposed to be funny that you'll sometimes see between characters who clearly are attracted to each other but won't admit it, and they're bickering back and forth. And I just am not buying it. There is a character refers to Brie as Cariad, which is apparently like a Welsh word that means beloved, sweetheart, something like that. And so there's like a two-page conversation where she goes back and forth with this character, like, you called me Cariad. What does that mean? What do you think it means? What does it mean? It was a little corny. So I don't know. I wasn't as into the dialogue. And I felt like as they moved from place to place on this quest, I just felt like it was meandering. I felt like it was lacking direction and that I wasn't feeling the progression. Are we getting more information? And then we're using that information to move to the next place. It just felt very meandering and like there wasn't a strong sense of direction. And we do continue to develop the Root Crafter world and the sort of underground world of Root Crafter and Bree learning more about that. And I like to see those characters again. I like to learn more about that. But the way that it shows up in this book, I don't want to say stereotypical, but the way that it shows up in this book, I don't know. I don't know what I wanted from it. I wanted it to feel a little bit more complex. It's just very much here's the white people over here being toxic and terrible, and here's the Black women primarily. Oh, there is a male character, Valek, who is an ancient very old kind of demon hybrid. I actually like that character a lot. So we have one Black male character, but the Black women mostly being earthy and balanced and connected to their ancestors. And it just, I don't know. I wanted a way we can do this that just feels a little bit more complicated. And the way Brie interacts with and navigates her ancestors as she finds more out about her ancestral line, it was a little bit challenging for me as someone who does do ancestral veneration. And it's not like you can't have issues. All ancestors are not, everyone ain't elevated when they go to the other side, right? You can have complicated relationships with your ancestors. You can have feelings in your heart, particularly ancestors that you knew in life who may have done harm. You could have things that you need to say to them, even once they've passed on. But Bree's disrespectful. Sorry, she's just disrespectful. And it's that fantasy kind of chip on their shoulder, sassy protagonist character within this context of this ancestral magic. And the way those come up against each other, it was a little bit difficult for me as someone who, while I'm not initiated practitioner of any of these religions, I do honor my ancestors, right? It just felt kind of disrespectful. Yeah, so there's a plot turn that happens with that I just was just not fond of at all. And I can't say too much about it. I can't say too much about it without spoilers. You would just have to read to see for yourself. But it feels like in the first book, it feels like Bree really wants to get connected to her ancestral line. Yes, she has a goal, and that's still to find out what happened to her mother. And in the second book, it feels more like she's using them for power, right? And that's her only interest in them, is to use them for power to defend herself in this world with this demon battle. Yeah, I don't know. You know what it was giving? It was kind of giving like Daenerys in the Dothraki. That's probably too harsh a way to say it, but even though I loved Game of Thrones, I loved Daenerys when the show was out. But retrospectively, a lot of Black people have done critiques of that character and the way in which that character moves through these worlds of like who we would call people of color, and gets like language and certain kinds of qualities and characteristics and tools and resources from them that she can then use to go fight her battle with the Seven Kingdoms. And even though Bree is Black, like these other people, there is an element of her relationship to the root crafter community that was feeling like that. This is just something she needed to get so she could go navigate and fight in this other world. And the connection between them, I thought, could have been more connected. And in the first book, it was definitely implied, even stated, that the magic is at its core the same. It's just that the Black people use it differently. Then in the second book, it becomes a different type of magic altogether. And I don't really quite get that. Also, the world building and the magic in Bloodmarked. In the first book, it was dense, but I got it. In the second book, it feels like elements keep getting added to it. And it just started to feel a little overly convoluted, and like things were being kind of made up as they were going along about how all of the magic works. There was also a lot of telling, not showing, even in moments where I felt like it could have been shown instead of told, where Bree is coming to realizations about how the magic works, but she's having to tell us that. Like, I suddenly realized that this is what I had to do, right? Rather than as readers, us being able to realize how the magic was working. So those are some of the issues I have with the second book. It wasn't so bad that I think I won't continue the series. I don't think it was bad. I actually don't think it was a bad book. I had some problems with it, but I am still curious to see how things all shake out. So I think I will complete this series. And I'm also a completionist, which is why I don't take on a lot of trilogies and series, because I have this impulse to push myself to finish them. And if you're not necessarily enjoying the books, then it kind of becomes a chore. But I did enjoy some of it. I don't think it was badly written at all. There are just some things that I have questions about, and it just kind of went in a different direction than what I expected. So I want to use Legendborn and Bloodmark as an opening for talking about some of the things I am seeing as I read more contemporary YA fantasy, particularly by Black authors. So, one thing that I'm seeing, one critique that I have, is what I call beautiful gowns. So, people I sure know about the pop culture moment of, was it Aretha Franklin, who they were asking her about different celebrities, and she said, "Oh, good songwriter, yada, yada, yada." And they asked her about a specific person, and she said, beautiful gowns." Right? And I don't think she meant that as shady, but it was literally, that's the first thing that came to mind, beautiful gowns, right? But it was a really funny moment, and I do feel like a lot of YA fantasy books, I don't think this is particular to Black authors, actually. So I'm gonna say YA fantasy books, period, have something I call beautiful gowns syndrome. It looks beautiful. Like, the visuals look beautiful. First of all, the covers. Oh my God. I've bought so many of these books just based on these freaking like gorgeous covers. So the covers are beautiful. And then the scenes, the visuals that the authors are painting are very beautiful and striking, right? So the image of the armor like materializing out of thin air and fastening itself on, the image of the silver fire of the aether or of the ether. There are moments that I can see so vividly and they look really beautiful. However, I don't feel them. I see it and I'm like, "Oh man, that's really cool. That would look so great on screen," right? But I don't feel it. I shouldn't just be seeing the beautiful visions in my mind. I should be feeling myself in the body of that character, right? What does it feel like as the armor clenches onto your body? What is the fear of what you're about to experience in this fight as these monsters come out of the trees, right? I don't feel like I'm feeling it. I feel like I'm just seeing it. Right? And I think and I've been trying to think because I've been feeling this about a lot of books that I read lately, a lot of new releases in particular, and I'm like, "What is it? What is it that's missing?" And I think it goes back to something Nalo Hopkinson, who is probably my favorite speculative fiction writer and one of my mentors and one of my professors in graduate school. But something Nalo Hopkinson said once about how she makes all of these fantastical worlds real is you start with the body. You start with the body, you get into the character's body. So the panel on which I saw her talking about this was talking about a short story that I can't remember the name of, and I can't remember the collection it was in, but a short story she read about a girl who goes, dives into the water to fight this underwater monster and she says, "I start with the body." So she never tells you, "Oh, I jumped in the water, yada yada." But she talks about the feeling of the lungs constricting as they fill with carbon dioxide and the gelatinous slippery texture of the monster's tentacles, right? You feel it like it's the sensory experience that takes you into the moment. So you're not just a person reading words on a page that are giving you beautiful images, but you were in the body of that character. I actually think Legendborn does that pretty well. The very first page of the prologue is about Bree and it's after her mother has died and she's in the hospital, right? So here's just a short part. We found her on Route 70 around 8, the police officer says. The air conditioner kicks on. The sharp scents of hospital grade hand soap and floor cleaner blow across our faces. So to me, that's great writing because it takes me into that moment. And that's something that happens sometimes, like in moments of trauma, is that all of your senses are heightened. At least this is how I've sometimes experienced it, is that some your senses are heightened and you find yourself focusing on the clicking tock and like clock and like all these like sensations and sounds and smells. To this day, smelling hospital grade hand soap. It's this weird mix of a trigger and a comfort to me because my son was in the NICU when he was born for a month, right? The day after he was born, they took him from my hospital room and put him in the NICU. And so I never got to rest. Like after I gave birth, like I went home the next day, I was back the next morning just being in the NICU. So for like a month, I pretty much lived in that NICU sitting next to his bed all day. And of course, when you go into a NICU with all of these vulnerable, fragile babies, because he was in a high intensity NICU, you have to wash your hands all the time. You've got to like soap up, you've got to put on all this stuff. So, yeah, that hand soap, right? Like, I remember the smell of that hand soap so much. And every time I'm back in the hospital, the smell of that hand soap just brings back memories for me, and it's a blend of positive and negative because it was negative in the sense that my baby was in the hospital, I couldn't take him home, I never got to rest after he was born, I was on my feet after a difficult 3-day birth, I was on my feet constantly driving back and forth to the hospital. So on one hand, and I watched him go through all these painful procedures, right? It was terrible, but also when I was washing my hands with that pink soap, it meant I was gonna see my baby. So I also have this pleasure that I feel when I smell that smell too, right? So, I mean, that's a long explanation for a couple of lines of sentences, but I think good writing can do that. Good writing can put you into the moment. It could put you into the body of the character. So you're experiencing it more as you experiencing it than you like watching this beautiful thing unfold with all these pretty colors. Another problem I'm noticing with YA Black fantasy is bloating. I feel like the books are bloated. I feel like these books do not need to be 300, 400, 500, 600 pages, right? And then it's 3 or 4 books or more. And I'm like, for what? I just don't think it's necessary. I think they're kind of being bloated on purpose so that we have multiple books because that just seems to be like the trend with a lot of fantasy. I think the book should only be that long if that's how long it takes to tell the story, right? I feel like some of these stories are being stretched out over more time and action than is actually necessary because that is the trend. And also because that is commercially successful, right? Some of these authors are getting multiple book deals at the time of signing. So you've got to produce more books in the series. And I just don't know that every story needs all these books. Blood Marked, I just feel like there's so much traveling, different locations, all these fight scenes here, fight scenes there. And it just didn't all feel necessary to me. And I don't think that all of this really was developing the story forward and telling us more about the characters and what they were facing. It just seemed like the opportunity for another cool action scene to enjoy if you're someone who enjoys that. And so both of these problems, beautiful gowns and bloating, I think go back to one thing, and that is the influence of these major film fantasy franchises that are based on YA fantasy. I think one of the reasons YA fantasy is so popular in the booktube world and among writers, and that we're getting so many multiple book series and all of that. I think one of the reasons is because of the success of franchises like Twilight, Harry Potter, Hunger Games. I think everyone wants to be the next person to do that. I'm not saying that's the only reason that these writers write, right? There is a way in which the thing that you already want to do, the passion that you already have, comes into connection with opportunity for commercial success, right? I've always been interested in mermaids. I've dabbled in writing about mermaids before. I would be lying if I didn't say that I didn't see opportunity in the fact that when I actually really, really started seeing more text and writing about this and seeing that there's something here, also seeing that, oh, we've got a Black girl cast as a Little Mermaid. I could really bring this together. Just because something is seems to be commercially viable doesn't mean that it is not your passion and you wouldn't have wanted to do it anyway. But I do think that the success of these film franchises is having an impact in the way people are writing their books. I also just think that generationally, as writers are growing up, right? Like when I was growing up reading fantasy, I didn't really have access to the kind of visual language of fantasy that we have now. I was watching First Night. That was the Arthurian legend. I was watching that movie with Sean Connery, Richard Gere, right? And Julia Ormond, right? That was what I was watching. And there wasn't even any magic in it. I think a fantasy movie I watched growing up was that Willow movie, the kind of dwarf who is taking care of that little baby. Right? This is what I was watching. They could only do so much in terms of the monsters and the visual effects. Xena Warrior Princess, right? That's what I was watching, right? I didn't have access to the Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter, the way the visual effects are now, the language, what you can do with film now is not something that I had access to. I think we've got writers writing now who have grown up watching these films, and I feel like these films are influencing the way they're writing the books. So for a film, having these meandering journey with all these fight scenes, that's awesome, right? Because it's gonna give the film a lot of action. but I don't necessarily think it's the best thing for character development and depth on the page. And I think that's also playing into the beautiful gowns, right? Now we can accomplish these gorgeous visuals on screen. So I think sometimes when people are writing, they're trying to write for what that will look like because they know there's actual a possibility if your book gets optioned of bringing this stuff to life. And I think there's an excitement in that that sometimes people forget about the interior world of the characters, which is what you really need for fiction. That's my opinion. That is a theory. I think I need to read a lot more fantasy, and I think I need to read a lot more fantasy across time periods from before Lord of the Rings, which I think is one of the just first, just really super visually impressive fantasy films series, and after to really, really prove that. Right? But this is my theory. I feel like I'm watching the book instead of experiencing it. And then there are some things that I think are kind of specific to some recurring things I'm seeing across Black YA fantasy. Black girl in a white world, very few other Black characters, usually a white boy love interest, not always. So she seems kind of disconnected from a Black world. Parent is usually very present in the first book, but if it's a series, by the second book, the parents are kinda off the page. There doesn't seem to be a presence of, like, a close-knit Black family, and I don't think all Black families are close-knit, but I do think there is Black culture, not only just African American, but also African diaspora cultures where our extended families are very close to us, and I mean, I do think that that is something that's changing. I'm not as close to my extended family, and my son isn't as embedded in his extended family as I was when I was a little girl. So I do think that that's something that maybe is changing. Maybe that is also something that's connected to class and not just race, right? And as our families we move to different places, we're more likely to be geographically distant. So maybe this is something that's changing, but it is something that I think is distinctive to Black culture, and I have not seen in a Black fantasy novel is a Black character with a lot of family. It's just usually them and one surviving parent. Well, the other parent is gone or dead. So, yeah, that's something I've noticed. Very few, if any, Black boys or men. Like, it's like they don't exist. And the way in which Blackness shows up, the way in which the character's identity shows up is in pretty specific ways that to me don't capture a range. Sometimes the characters still I don't wanna say they don't feel Black, because of course, Blackness is not a monolith. We're not all Black in the same way. I'm a Black girl who grew up with Black parents who both came from the South. I grew up in South LA in a all Black community. I really didn't interact regularly with white people really till I went to college. So I grew up in a very particular way, very embedded in a specific kind of Blackness. And that is not everyone's Blackness. However, I do think it's more of us than not who kind of grew up with more Black. Maybe that's changing. Some of the things I've noticed as a professor is that a lot of my students are growing up in really like much more integrated environments than I did. So maybe these are the people who are writing these books. They are Black women who grew up in more integrated environments where they were the only one. So can we fault them for that? Can we fault them for a world that looks like the world that they experienced? However, I also think that there's this way in which, again, this is not the fault of the authors, but there's this way in which the industry wants Black books to have white major characters because they still have this feeling that white people won't need somebody to attach themselves to, that they need someone to identify with, right? So one of the things I've noticed, Cell is looking this character, he's looking a little ambiguous on this cover, but this character Cell, I mean, in the book, he's a white boy, right? So it's really interesting to me because I feel like some of these covers, again, just like I said, the cover for Legendborn and Amari and the Night Brothers is almost identical. The cover for the sequels is almost identical too. I don't have the sequel to Amari and the Night Brothers, but on the cover to Bloodmark, you see the white boy over her shoulder. And it's like the cover for the sequel to Amari and Night Brothers, which I don't have yet, it's the exact same thing as the white boy over her shoulder. So it's kind of something that I see happening in a lot of TV and film that, okay, you're seeing like more like Black protagonists, even in these shows that aren't necessarily created for a specifically Black audience, but there will always be a white best friend, a white group of friends, a white love interest. There's always these white major characters, right? And they're usually point of view characters who get their own point of view segments. It's just this idea that white people will not enter into a text if they're not there. I would like to think that that isn't true, right? One of the most successful movies ever, Black Panther, it's almost no white people. I mean, you got that one white man, like the FBI or CIA agent or whatever, but I mean, there isn't that much. And people were able to get into that. So, yeah, that is something I'm seeing. That is kind of a pattern. This is not all. This is just something I've seen more than once. So, after I finished reading Bloodmarked, I ended up kind of confused, a little perturbed, and I was looking online for reviews, and most of the reviews are like, "Oh my god, I love this so much. Oh my god." And so I'm just, am I missing something? What am I missing? And I finally found a review that was critical of the book by Miss WOC Reader. So this is a YouTuber who I will link in the show notes. And she said something that I'm like, "Oh, yeah, I see that." She said that in Black YA fantasy, there are 3 ways in which Blackness shows up, and those are the only 3 ways that Blackness shows up. And that is the themes of racism, ancestry, and hair. And I was like, "Wow, she's not wrong." She is not wrong. Now, I would say the first Black YA fantasy that I read, to my recent memory, is Skin of the Sea, which is a Black mermaid book that I've written a review of, and I'm thinking about writing about it in my book. And I enjoyed this book. I have critiques, of course, because I always do, but I did enjoy this book. One of the things that I wrote really positively about in my review for the Los Angeles Review of Books, which I will link, is the representation of hair in the book. Like the character's hair, Simi, the main character, her hair is definitely a motif. It's definitely a motif in the book. It's something that comes up again and again. There's a scene where they braid a map into her hair. And I thought it was really beautiful and powerful. I liked the hair stuff because, as someone who grew up reading fantasy by white authors, I had never seen that before. I had never seen Black hair play that kind of role in a fantasy text. However, I do see it becoming a theme in a way that's feeling a little heavy-handed. So in Song Below Water, which is another Black mermaid book that I haven't written or really talked about yet, the main character is a natural hair influencer. Right? So there's all this hair stuff, right, in the book. Not a lot of hair stuff in Amari. Well, this is middle grade anyway, so it doesn't even kind of belong in the same category as these other books. But yeah, hair definitely comes up a lot. In Legendborn, it's fine. She refers to her hair being messed up after battles and stuff. And oh, my hair was all over my head. She does keep saying my curls, and that was throwing me a little bit. You know, I'm 4C variety. I have locks now, so I guess I do refer to my hair a lot as my locks. Oh, my locks or whatever, but I don't know. I feel like most of the time I'll just say my hair. So just seeing my curls got out of the bun, my curls, this, my on every page. I was just like, do the curly-haired girls refer to their hair as curls, or do you just say hair? It's like the book wants to constantly remind you that she's Black and that she has Black hair, that her hair is curly, and it does get a little heavy-handed. And it's one of those things that I think speaks to something that a lot of book reviewers have been talking about in terms of Black books, particularly Black YA books, is that it feels like they're written for a non-Black audience because they're constantly reminding people of things that Black people don't need to be reminded of. And Though I do kinda see that. I do definitely see what people mean when they say that, the hair stuff. So in the first book, it didn't really I mean, the curls thing was kind of a lot, but in the second book is when it gets a little bit more obvious. There is a part where Bree is on the run and her friend Mariah is like, "Oh, I've been waiting to get into this hair." She's gonna do Bree's hair and do something practical for them to be on the run, and she does, like, twists in the front with, like, curls, and Miss WOC Reader also pointed out that that's not practical, right? If you're really on the run, you're gonna do some cornrows. That's not actually what you're gonna do, but that is very visually appealing, and this is the hairstyle, right, that she has on the cover for this book, so that is the hairstyle they're describing in that scene, and yeah, it's not really practical for being on the run. It's just stuff like that. There's this scene where her friend Alice comes to bring her things while she's on the run, and she said, "Oh, and I brought conditioner because 'cause I'm sure wherever you're going, they only have white people stuff," and I chuckled at the line. I thought it was funny. I was like, "Okay, that's kind of a nice culturally specific detail. She needs her conditioner." But then I'm also like, how obsessive do y'all think we are about our hair? Yeah, my hair is a big deal. If I'm on a run, I'm going to be like, damn, I don't have my scarf. But at the end of the day, if I'm fighting demons, I'm probably not worried about conditioning my hair if I'm fighting demons. So it's like, I kind of get what the author is trying to do in weaving the realities of Black people's lives into the action, but also really not that big. If I'm fighting demons on a daily basis, I'm not really worried about my conditioner. So, so she says racism, hair, and ancestry, right? So this book does deal with a lot of like racialized history, and then we've got the ancestral magic, the rootcraft magic, and I'm like, yeah, I see it, and I mean, individually, I don't mind those things. I didn't even mind them much in the first book. I think that when you have these things, but there's not enough depth and development, and there's not other ways in which kind of her culture and her community are sort of showing up, then I think that's when it starts to become kind of like cliche. So those are some things I've noticed. But I do think that middle grade fantasy actually often does a better job. So I think on my next episode, I'm going to be talking about some Black authored middle grade children's fantasies and what I like about them. Thank you for listening. You have just listened to the Merwomanist podcast with Mami Melusine. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, I would love 5 stars, and subscribe for future episodes. You can follow me on Instagram at Mami, that's MAMI, _ Melusine, or at Merwomanist Podcast, on LinkedIn at Jalandra Davis, or my website, jalandradavis.com. Wishing you love and laughter and hoping to see you swim this way again.